When you think of theme parks, you probably think of roller coasters, or maybe creepy guys in animal suits stalking children, but mainly roller coasters. And what a brilliant design, distilling the excitement of transportation by vehicle into its best parts, going fast and going down hills. Over on the western edge of the Dreamland Park on Coney Island in the early years of the 20th century, there was an attraction that was built before Dreamland, and oddly enough, the land that it stood on is the only part of the original Dreamland Park that still has some form of amusement attraction on it today, over 120 years later. Somehow, this one lot survived for over a century as part of the classic era of Coney Island, even as Dreamland itself disappeared and the land around it changed hands and morphed until it became the New York City Aquarium. Appropriately enough, the attraction on this parcel of land was, is, and perhaps always will be a roller coaster. Welcome to Meet Me in Dreamland, the series where this season I will be... Okay, wait. We gotta talk, because I keep getting this question about what do I mean by a season? I mean, I'm just some guy sitting here on YouTube talking about ancient theme parks. How do I know when the season's over? What's the next season? Other questions like that. So, by way of a definitive answer, I'm going to say, I don't really know. Oh yeah, my dog's in here, so if you hear him moving around, that's what that is. When I started doing this video series, these many months ago, I thought eventually I will run out of Dreamland material or Coney Island material, so maybe I should call it a season just to set the expectation that at some point I might be talking about something else. But that day has not yet come. So, to you I say, don't worry about it. We're talking about Coney Island today. We're talking about the history of roller coasters. And now, here is the part where I say, won't you meet me in Dreamland? At some point in prehistory, a human being tried to walk down a hill, tripped, and then rolled down the hill. Once they got to the bottom and realized that they weren't hurt, they figured out that actually they kind of liked it. So they did it again and again, just like every single child in a grassy park has done ever since. So how do we get from this to this? Well, somebody somewhere thought to themselves, what if we built a special hill just for doing that? Enter the Russians. One winter in the 15th century, when there wasn't much to do other than try desperately not to starve or freeze to death, enterprising Slavs in St. Petersburg built a tall wooden trellis and a slide. Using water from the nearby river, they slicked the ramp and rode down it on blocks of ice. It was fun, so they started doing it every year, and the simple pleasure of going down a hill, refined as it was by the brilliant idea of engineering the hill for maximum thrills, spread throughout the country, even getting the royal court involved. Of course, safety was something of an afterthought. One observer noted, sometimes if the sledges meet any resistance, the person in them tumbles head over heels. That, I suppose, is the joke. I was terrified out of my wits for fear of being obliged to go down this shocking place, for I had not only the dread of breaking my neck, but of being exposed to indecency too frightful to think on without horror. Of course, the problem with this approach was that you could only do it in winter. In the 1750s, architect Antonio Rinaldi conquered this issue by designing one of these Russian mountains, as people in Europe were calling them, for Catherine the Great, who rumor has it enjoyed a good ride. These mountains, however, were not icy, but in fact a feature of Catherine's summer palace, the Oranienbaum. They used wheeled carts rather than sleds and ice to create thrills. Called the Katalnaya Gorka, or Coasting Pavilion, The Baroque thrill ride featured ornate wheeled gondolas with gold leaf accents. Riders would enter the gondolas from the pavilion's 20-meter-high balcony, then coast down a grooved center track and over 4 hills. When they reached the end of the 500-meter ride, the carts would be hauled back up to the top by horses. Sadly, after Catherine's death in 1796, the coaster fell into disrepair and was dismantled in the 1850s. But you can still visit the pavilion portion of the Katalnaya Gorka if you're so inclined. It looks beautiful in and of itself, but I can't help but think of it as the venue for a long-gone attraction, sort of like standing in line for the Haunted Mansion only to find it closed when you got there. Now, in the United States, Russian mountains, icy or otherwise, didn't really catch on, but coal mining did. In 1827, the Lehigh Coal and Navigation Company built one of the country's first railroads, and the first one that was more than 5 miles long, in the Pennsylvania mountains to haul coal from the mine to the Lehigh Canal. As any Minecraft player will tell you, Minecrafts are pretty fun, and by the middle of the 1800s, the entirely gravity-powered Mauch-Chunk Switchback Railway was attracting tourists who hitched rides from the mountain to the waterway just for the thrill of it, including Thomas Edison and Ulysses S. Grant. The Switchback Railroad itself had become obsolete for hauling coal by the 1870s, and the Lehigh Company built a more modern steam engine-powered railroad to replace it. However, because of the Mauch-Chunk line's popularity with pleasure seekers, it continued to operate strictly for tourists for another 50 years. One man who rode the Mauch-Chunk line was an inventor and hosiery merchant named Lamarcus Thompson, aka L.A. Thompson. Having recently suffered a nervous breakdown and being warned by his doctors that he needed to avoid any stressful indoor occupations, he had sold his interest in the hosiery company and was contemplating where his future might take him. After experiencing the excitement of the Mauch-Chunk, he was reminded of the mechanical carts and toys he had put together as a child and how much pleasure he had derived from building them. With that in mind, he landed on the idea of building a smaller version of a switchback railway for the express purpose of giving passengers the kind of enjoyment he'd had in Pennsylvania. He wasn't the first to come up with the idea. Other folks had experimented with small-scale pleasure railways, usually in a circular layout prior to Thompson's attempt, but his approach made more of a lasting impact on amusement park history than any of the others. Casting about for a touristy place to construct his switchback railway, he landed on Coney Island, which was swiftly becoming a destination for tourists seeking excitement and amusement away from the humdrum of their workaday lives. In 1884, Thompson rented a lot at 10th and Surf Avenue right beside the future location of Dreamland, and constructed his first scenic railway. By today's standards, it was a pretty tame ride, but in the 1890s it was light years ahead of his circular railroad predecessors, primarily because Thompson didn't stick with a circular layout, and in those gravity-powered days that meant that he could make higher hills and longer tracks. For 5 cents, customers would climb to the top of a 50-foot platform, board the cars in sideways-facing seats, and then coast down an undulating hill at about 6 miles per hour before coasting to a stop. At this point, the passengers would exit the gondola, climb up a higher staircase, and wait while the attendants pulled the cars uphill to the platform. Then they would board again and coast back to the origin point. Although it was hardly thrilling compared to what we think of as a roller coaster, it was thrilling enough for folks in the late 19th century, and soon Thompson was making bank. He also attracted the attention of other amusement-minded businessmen, and as the idea of amusement parks spread throughout the U.S., he built some 50 of his railways in parks all over the country over the next 4 years. And his success inevitably attracted competitors. One of the first of these was Philip Hinkle. Albuquerque fans of Hinkle's Family Fun Center don't get excited. I couldn't find any connection between this guy and our guy. Philip Hinkle, having lived in San Francisco and experienced the famous cable car system for climbing hills, incorporated a steam-powered winch to hoist roller coasters back to the top of their inclines without needing men or horses to haul them back up. This meant that hills could be higher and descents even more exciting. And, in another stunning innovation, Hinkle came up with the idea of having the coaster's seats facing not sideways, as in Thompson's design, but, wait for it, toward the front. This offered a few advantages. One, guests could anticipate the approaching hills, and when going down them, experience a sensation of falling, and it let couples sit close together without having to share their space with anyone else, which was a surefire recipe for canoodling. This combination of excitement and intimacy caused Thompson's competitors to quickly draw more crowds than his switchback railway. Thompson adapted to a certain extent, incorporating features like the steam-powered lift that allowed for a continuous track, but even as other ride operators added higher hills and faster cars, he resisted doing the same for his railways. In his mind, the faster coasters were bound to frighten guests and lead to accidents. Instead, he decided that riders would be more interested in safer, slower coasters that offered scenic views. In the first years of the 20th century, the lot beside Thompson's original switchback railway was developed into Dreamland Park. Thompson used the opportunity to redesign the switchback, which had been losing money for several years at this point, into one of his scenic railways, using elaborate scenery and paintings to give the illusion of an exotic trip through, as the advertising asserted, mystic glades. At its opening, the New York Daily Tribune lauded this railway as one of the best ever seen and featuring beautiful architecture and a commodious lobby. In 1906, it was remodeled again to feature travels through a giant seashell, and in 1910 it was lengthened and transformed into a trip to the North Pole, complete with ice floes and polar bears. Meanwhile, Thompson's scenic railways continued to proliferate in other Coney Island parks, with such evocative themes as the Dragon's Gorge and Pike's Peak drawing visitors in. Yes, a gorge full of dragons and a mountain with a road on it. Again, people were more excitable back then. Unfortunately for Thompson, the public's taste for roller coastering continued to move toward thrills and excitement and away from scenic sights, and Thompson continued to resist that change even as more and more parks opted for faster rides. By 1911, even his first switchback railway at Dreamland succumbed to the zeitgeist and was closed down to make way for a new, speedy coaster called the Giant Racer. This new coaster became famous even before it was completed when, during the 1911 Dreamland fire that destroyed the park, and don't worry, we'll get to it, the racer's steel construction served as an effective firebreak that many credited with saving the rest of the island from falling to the conflagration. If this at all bothered L.A. Thompson, it wasn't long before he could smugly tout the advantages of his slower, safer rides. On Sunday, September 3rd, 1911, a terrible accident on the Giant Racer left 2 women dead and 2 more injured. The New York Times described the scene. The shrill scream of a woman, followed by a chorus of frightened cries and the screech of metal against metal and of splintered wood, brought everyone within earshot running to the Giant Racer. High up on the steel structure of tracks and supporting beams, the first comers saw one of the 3-car trains which carried passengers over the swift ride, slowly dragging to a stop along a level stretch of track 40 feet above the street. The rear car was tilted outwards at an angle of 45 degrees, and from it hung the limp forms of 2 women. 2 other women and 1 man, the former screaming, were struggling to hold their places in the side of the tilted car. In the cars ahead, terrified men and women glanced back, not certain of what had happened, but frightened by the jolting and the uproar. With the rear car bouncing over the ties and dragging back like an anchor, the little train at last halted. It stopped beside a platform of narrow boards left in the structure by workmen who erected it last spring, and onto this flimsy aisle of safety, several employees of the ride quickly helped the frightened passengers. When they would have helped the two women in the last car, they saw that their heads, chests, and arms had been crushed and battered by the pounding against the supports of the structure. The first doctor to reach them said that they had died instantly. Sadly, this was not the only accident to occur on the racer. A rider was flung from his car in 1913, dying instantly when he struck the supports. And in 1925, 3 ride testers were seriously injured when their car uncoupled on a hill and then rolled backwards to slam into, you guessed it, the structural supports. 1926 marked the racer's last season. Over the winter, it was torn down and replaced by one of the most iconic Coney Island rides ever, the Cyclone. The Cyclone was a stunning achievement in coaster design. 2,640 feet of track, featuring 6 drops and speeds of up to 60 miles per hour. And best of all, it was made of an incredible wonder material.
The whole thing is made of wood. Wood! You know, that indestructible substance that NASA uses for its space shuttles.
Amazingly, the Cyclone still stands after nearly a century, weathering literal storms and figurative ones in the form of attempts to raise it or simply let it decay, or use the land to extend the New York Aquarium. Somehow, it has survived, delighting and terrifying riders to this day, and serving as both a monument to one of America's very first roller coasters, the Switchback Railway built on the very site 129 years ago, and a symbol of L.A. Thompson's ultimate failure, the victory of thrills and speed over scenery and gentle hills. We haven't heard the last of the Cyclone. Its 100-year history is well worth an episode of its own. And you'll definitely want to know when that drops, right? So now is a great time to hit that subscribe button, hit that tiny little bell, throw in a like just for good measure, tell your friends, tell your family, tell your mom. And hey, did you know that I also have a Patreon? I am a tiny little baby creator, so every little bit of help and inspiration and support that you can offer me is just immeasurably beneficial towards my wanting to continue doing this. If you would like to buy me a beer or a coffee or the beverage of your choice, you can go to patreon.com/Ty Bannerman. That's my name. Of course, you'll be able to see some exclusive content over there. You'll get early access to these episodes. You'll be able to see some other mini videos that I'll be making, including the time that a chimpanzee named Betty Snookums broke free from her enclosure and caused mayhem all over Coney Island for 3 hours, including darting all over the giant racer. You definitely want to hear that, and that is, in fact, the very next video that I'll be making. Alright, that's enough shilling. And let me just do the thing where I take off my hat and say,